Good afternoon. So today, I'm going to read from a book review that was done in the New York Times, a few quotes from that, about the Red Book. And at the same time, I'm also going to read the preface to both the Reader's Edition and the main edition of the Red Book, which is by Ulrich Horney, one of Dr. Jung's grandsons. And just a minute, let me make sure my slideshow is operating properly. So today I'm going to read the book review from the New York Times, or excerpts from it, and then I will read the preface to both the Reader's Edition and the folio edition of the Red Book. And these prefaces are written by Ulrich Horney, who is one of Dr. Jung's grandsons. And this first part came to me from the Carl Jung Depth Psychology site.blog and from my friend Louis LaFontaine. And he entitled it, "Some People Feel That Nobody Should Read the Book." And so if that didn't get your attention, nothing will. Okay, so reading on. Some people feel that nobody should read the book, and some feel that everybody should read it. The truth is, nobody really knows. Most of what has been said about the book, what it is, what it means, is the product of guesswork. Because from the time it was begun in 1914 in a smallish town in Switzerland, it seems that only about 24 people have managed to read or even have much of a look at it. Whether or not we would, mind you, I'm playing on the slideshow here a few excerpted images from the folio edition of the Red Book. The Reader's Edition has none of the images, but many of them can be found online. Whether or not he would have wanted it this way, Jung, who regarded himself as a scientist, is today remembered more as a countercultural icon, a proponent of spirituality outside religion, and the ultimate champion of dreamers and seekers everywhere, which has earned him both posthumous respect and posthumous ridicule. Jung's ideas laid the foundation for the widely used Myers-Briggs personality test and influenced the creation of Alcoholics Anonymous. His central tenets, the existence of a collective unconscious and the power of archetypes, have seeped into the larger domain of New Age thinking while remaining more at the fringes of mainstream psychology. Working at Zurich's Bergelslee Psychiatric Hospital, Jung listened intently to the ravings of schizophrenics, believing they held clues to both personal and universal truths. At home, in his spare time, he pored over Dante, Goethe, Swedenborg, and Nietzsche. He began to study mythology and world cultures, applying what he learned to the live feed from the unconscious, claiming that dreams offered a rich and symbolic narrative coming from the depths of the psyche. Somewhere along the way, he started to view the human soul, not just the mind and the body, as requiring specific care and development, an idea that pushed him into a province long occupied by poets and priests, but not so much by medical doctors and empirical scientists. Jung soon found himself in opposition not just to Freud, but also to most of his field, the psychiatrists who constituted the dominant culture at the time, speaking the clinical language of symptom and diagnosis behind the deadbolts of asylum wards. Separation was not easy. As his convictions began to crystallize, Jung, who was at that point an outwardly successful and ambitious man with a young family, a thriving private practice, and a big, elegant house on the shores of Lake Zurich, felt his own psyche starting to teeter and slide, until finally he was dumped into what would become a life-altering crisis. What happened next to Carl Jung has become, among Jungians and other scholars, the topic of enduring legend and controversy. It has been characterized variously as a creative illness, a descent into the underworld, a bout with insanity, a narcissistic self-deification, a transcendence, a midlife breakdown, and an inner disturbance mirroring the upheaval of World War I. Whatever the case, in 1913, Jung, who was then 38, got lost in the soup of his own psyche. He was haunted by troubling visions and heard inner voices. Grappling with the horror of some of what he saw, he worried in moments that he was, in his own words, menaced by a psychosis or doing a schizophrenia. Jung recorded it all, first taking notes in a series of small black journals. He then expounded upon and analyzed his fantasies, writing in a regal, prophetic tone in the big red leather book. The book detailed an unabashedly psychedelic voyage through his own mind, a vaguely Homeric progression of encounters with strange people taking place in a curious, shifting dreamscape. Writing in German, he filled 205 oversized pages with elaborate calligraphy and with richly hued, staggeringly detailed paintings. The book tells the story of Jung trying to face down his own demons as they emerge from the shadows. The results are humiliating, sometimes unsavory. In it, Jung travels the land of the dead, falls in love with a woman he later realizes is his sister, gets squeezed by a giant serpent, and in one terrifying moment, eats the liver of a little child. Quote, I swallow with desperate efforts. It is impossible. Once again, and once again, I almost faint. It is done. Unquote. At one point, even the devil criticizes Jung as hateful. He worked on his Red Book, and he called it just that, the Red Book, on and off for about 16 years, long after his personal crisis had passed. But he never managed to finish it. He actively fretted over it, wondering whether to have it published and face ridicule from his scientifically oriented peers or to put it in a drawer and forget it. Regarding the significance of what the book contained, however, Jung was unequivocal. All my works, all my creative activity, he would recall later, has come from those initial fantasies and dreams. Jung evidently kept the Red Book locked in a cupboard in his house in the Zurich suburb of Küsnacht. When he died in 1961, he left no specific instructions about what to do with it. His son Franz, an architect and the third of Jung's 5 children, took over running the house and chose to leave the book. with its strange musings and elaborate paintings, where it was. Later, in 1984, the family transferred it to the bank, where since then it has fulminated as both an asset and as liability. For about 2 years, Shamdasani, this is Sono Shamdasani, the editor of the Red Book, for about 2 years, Shamdasani flew back and forth to Zurich, making his case to Jung's heirs. He had lunches and coffees and delivered a lecture. Finally, after what were, by all accounts, tense deliberations inside the family, Shamdasani was given a small salary and a color copy of the original book and was granted permission to proceed in preparing it for publication, though he was bound by a strict confidentiality agreement. When money ran short in 2003, the Philemon Foundation was created to finance Shamdasani's research. Having lived more or less alone with the book for almost a decade, Shamdasani, who is a lover of fine wine and the intricacies of jazz, these days has the slightly stunned aspect of someone who has only very recently found his way out of an enormous maze. When I visited him this summer in the book-stuffed duplex overlooking the Heath, he was just adding his 1051st footnote to the Red Book. Okay, that's the end of the New York Times comments. So now I'm going to look at your comments here briefly, and then I will go into the preface. And so Mr. Upaluri Krishnamurti says, society has put before you the ideal of a perfect man. No matter in which culture you were born, you have scriptural doctrines and traditions handed down to you to tell you how to behave. You are told that through due practice you can even eventually come into the state attained by the sages, saints, and saviors of mankind. And so you try to control your behavior, to control your thoughts, to be something unnatural. Greetings, Mr. Conover. Miles says, our brains are of two hemispheres, a duality, and some say actually two separate brains. Might schizophrenics be suffering from not able to reconcile these two halves? Who has the original Red Book? Okay, so let me go back to Mr. Krishnamurti's comment first. There are those among the followers of Dr. Jung's work who do believe that the Red Book and Dr. Jung's work is scriptural in its aspect. And I am among those. I agree with that perspective. And it was best described by Dr. Edward Edinger, I think. And more recently, his mantle has been taken up by Ann Belford Ulanoff, who is Emerita Professor of Psychiatry and Religion at Union Theological Seminary. I asked Dr. Ulanoff whether she regarded the Red Book as scripture, as her mentor Edward Edinger had. And that was at a conference in which she was the keynote speaker in June of 2017. Some of you know of that conference. But in any case, she obfuscated somewhat and didn't really say that it was scriptural. But as I look more and more at her work, I think that we would have to judge that she did regard it as scriptural, although that's just my opinion, and I'm very doubtful that Dr. Ulanoff would agree with me necessarily. But in any case, certainly Dr. Jung was a fully realized adept, regardless of how you want to define that, Mr. Krishnamurti. And I think he shows a way. And the reason I'm doing this channel and why I've been so committed to it is he has certainly helped me. And that is true over the last now almost 32 years. And I can relate. Well, I've often talked about how he has helped me, but it's interesting to note that he was once visited by a very prominent Indian man, and Dr. Jung asked this man, I'm sorry, I don't remember his name, but asked this man whether he had a guru. And the Indian man said, yes, my guru is so-and-so. And Dr. Jung said, you mean the guru that lived in the 13th century? And the man says, yes, I mean him. And so in my lifetime, I've had two gurus. One was Joseph Campbell for about the decade of the 90s, when I was warming up to read Dr. Jung's work directly. And then early in the 2000s, I began to read directly from the fire hose, that is the collected works of C.G. Jung. And that's partially thanks to the work of Louis LaFontaine, who runs the Carl Jung Depth Psychology page on Facebook. I urge you to take a look at that. When I first signed up for that page, Louis had about 4,000 followers. I think the number is now over 68,000 followers on his page. So obviously the work of Dr. Jung has become more and more popular as people have taken it into themselves. And I'm very interested in the aspects of Dr. Jung's work that relate to society as a whole, because I do think that the events of the 20th century were psychic events, and I think that Dr. Jung, through his collective unconscious and other ideas, shadow, for example, did comprehend what was going on, and I don't think we comprehend that by and large today, and so I'm hoping that we will. I just remember many times over the last couple of years when the talking heads on television, regardless of which cable channel you wish to watch for your news, are just dumbfounded by what's going on in the American government these days, and they don't understand it at all. And I do understand it. I see what is going on, and Dr. Jung would be able to explain it very clearly. And so I think that it's very important for all of us who are interested in the futures of our countries to take up Dr. Jung's work and understand what was going on. So anyway, and so Miles, I'm not going to comment on schizophrenia because I'm not a mental health professional, and I don't feel competent to do that. And in answer to your second question, who has the original Red Book, I presume it is still in the vault in Zurich, although I think it has come around the world, and there was a display of it at one point at the Library of Congress when the Red Book publication came out in 2009, but I actually don't know where the original book is at this point. And Harshit Rajura says, thank you for elaborating. You're welcome. Grenade says, unfortunately, schizophrenia isn't so simple to understand, and this is why I'm not going to comment on it. And, you know, I'm sure that there are discussions of it online, and I think that there are many superficial discussions of mental health issues online. One that came to my attention a couple of days ago is the so-called Dunning-Kruger effect, which I don't attribute to Dr. Jung's oeuvre at all, but I think it's very interesting and amusing considering our current situation. And so I will give you a link to it. And so it's just one of thousands of psychological ideas right now, so you might want to have a look at that. So Mr. Krishnamurti says, imagine a girl who comes out of a midnight movie. She is apprehensive and anxious that the taxi driver she got into would molest her as she is alone. This is a schizophrenic. Now, the paranoid believes that she is actually going through the experience of being raped. Okay, well, that's an observation. I'm not going to claim that that's a correct mental health assessment. And are you, in fact, a mental health professional, Mr. Krishnamurti? I'd appreciate it if you would comment on your professional skill to make that comment. I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm saying I just don't know. Okay, now I'm going to read the two prefaces to, I have to get my version of this going. All right, the two prefaces. I'm going to read the preface to the Red Book Reader's Edition first, and I will be reading to this, from this in both cases, but please understand that the images that you are seeing on my slideshow to my right in this scene, these images do not appear in the Reader's Edition. They only appear in the Folio Edition. And Grenade says, the irony of the Dunning-Kruger effect is that no one knows if they are under the influence of it. Safe to assume we are. Yes, we are. And at some level, I suspect so. But anyway, I'll leave it to everyone to make their own judgment. And also, I did want to mention, beneath this video, I have put a link to the making of the Red Book, which is really, really an interesting video by Digital Fusion. It's only a 3.5-minute video, but it's a very, very well done video, and I urge you to take a look at it because it'll give you new incentive to consider the Red Book for your own reading. Now, keep in mind that from my point of view, the Red Book represents visioning, a visioning period that Dr. Jung was going through in his midlife crisis period. And I, too, went through such a period, but I didn't have the benefit of being a psychiatrist when it happened to me. And that period for me emerged as a novel, which is available on our Dropbox if you want to read it. I put it in my drawer for 21 years, much as Dr. Jung put the Red Book in his drawer for the remaining 31 years of his life and the 48 years after his life before it was finally published. And I'm not saying that my novel is anything like the Red Book. It is not. But when the Red Book was published in 2009, I felt very comforted by it because when I read it, I said, "Oh my God, this is what happened to me." And I could recognize some experience that I had had. And so that gave me good insight and also the confidence to go ahead and start doing this video channel ultimately. And since 2010, I've been doing the archetypeinaction.com website. And so that's a website that now has approximately 3,500 essays on it, including the essays which appear in my book, Political Psychology. So Mr. Krishnamurti says, a guru is one who tells you to throw away all the crutches that we have been made to believe are essential for our survival. He would ask you to walk, and he would say that if you fall, you will arise and walk. Okay, yeah, I mean, that's a fair enough comment, I think. Certainly, Dr. Jung has been my guru for a long time, and I remember hearing news stories about him before his death, as a matter of fact, and I literally remember the day he died. I was 15 years old when that happened, or 14 years old, but I literally remember that day and the news stories that came out about it. And little did I know then that such things are synchronicities which may affect the rest of your life. But anyway, okay, so I'm going to read the one-page preface to the Reader's Edition first. More than a decade has passed since the memorable decision of the former Society of Heirs of C.G. Jung to release the Red Book for publication. Much consideration was given to what kind of audience this multi-layered work should be directed. Professional readers of works on the history of psychology, the general reader, visually receptive people oriented toward images, lovers of calligraphy, collectors of beautiful books. Which aspects should the format and the design of the publication foreground? These questions weren't easy to answer, since even the physical appearance of the precious original seemed to contain a message. Many proposals were discussed and discarded. It was W.W. Norton that finally found the appropriate solution, a complete facsimile edition, which was presented in its original format in 2009. Overwhelming success proved that the publisher was right. The work rapidly spread worldwide and is already available in 9 languages. Evidently, it was possible to design an edition that did justice not only to the many facets of the work, but also to the different types of audience. The list of people to whom the credit for this success is due is now of considerable length. However, 2 names especially deserve to be mentioned. Jim Myers of W.W. Norton and Sono Shamdasani of the Philemon Foundation. The present Reader's Edition contains the complete text of the original. It is specifically aimed toward those who would like to engage deeply with the literary documentation of Jung's inner development. It would undoubtedly accord with Jung's intention if this edition helps readers to make their reading more fruitful for their own development. Signed Ulrich Horny, Horny, H-O-E-R-N-I, Foundation of the Works of C.G. Jung, July 2012. Now, one of the reasons that the Red Book Reader's Edition was made available is that the main edition is quite expensive. And let me give you an appreciation of that. Sorry. Okay, so this is the folio edition, and as you can see, it's quite an enormous book, and so the first 200 pages of it appear like this, and they're actual photographs of the original. And in the back, then, there's approximately a 100-page introduction by Sono Shamdasani and the actual translation of the original German calligraphy. Okay. So now, because it's republished in the Reader's Edition, I will read the preface of the original work that was published in 2009. And, okay, so this preface does appear in the folio edition of the Red Book. All right, let me read on with this preface, and then I'll come back to your further comments. Preface. Since 1962, the existence of C.G. Jung's Red Book has been widely known. Yet only with the present publication is it finally accessible to a broad public. Its genesis is described in Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and has been the subject of numerous discussions in the secondary literature. Hence, I will only briefly outline it here. The year 1913 was pivotal in Jung's life. He began a self-experiment that became known as his confrontation with the unconscious and lasted until 1930. During this experiment, he developed a technique to get to the bottom of his inner processes, to translate the emotions into images, and to grasp the fantasies that were stirring underground. He later called this method active imagination. He first recorded these fantasies in his black books. He then revised these texts, added reflections on them, and copied them in a calligraphic script into a book entitled Liber Novus, bound in a red leather, accompanied by his own paintings. It has always been known as the Red Book. Jung shared his inner experiences with his wife and close associates. In 1925, he gave a report of his professional and personal development in a series of seminars at the Psychological Club in Zurich, in which he also mentioned his method of active imagination. Beyond this, Jung was guarded. His children, for example, were not informed about his self-experiment, and they did not notice anything unusual. Clearly, it would have been difficult for him to explain what was taking place. It was already a mark of favor if he allowed one of his children to watch him write or paint. Thus, for Jung's descendants, the Red Book had always been surrounded by an aura of mystery. In 1930, Jung ended his experiment and put the Red Book aside, unfinished. Although it had its honored place in his study, he let it rest for decades. Meanwhile, the insights he had gained through it directly informed his subsequent writings. In 1959, with the help of the old draft, he tried to complete the transcription of the text into the Red Book and to finish an incomplete painting. He also started on an epilogue, but for unknown reasons, both the calligraphic text and the epilogue break off in mid-sentence. Although Jung actively considered publishing the Red Book, he never took the necessary steps. In 1916, he privately published Septem Sermonis ad Mortuis, the Seven Sermons to the Dead, a short work that arose out of his confrontation with the unconscious. Even his 1916 essay, The Transcendent Function, in which he described the technique of active imagination, was not published until 1958. There are a number of reasons why he did not publish the Red Book. As he himself stated, it was unfinished. His growing interest in alchemy as a research topic distracted him. In hindsight, he described the detailed working out of his fantasies in the Red Book as a necessary but annoying aestheticizing elaboration. As late as 1957, he declared that the Black Books and the Red Book were autobiographical records that he did not want published in his collected works, because they were not of a scholarly character. As a concession, he allowed Agnella Jaffe to quote excerpts from the Red Book and the Black Books in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, a possibility which he made little use of. In 1961, Jung died. His literary estate became the property of his descendants, who formed the Society of Heirs of C.G. Jung. The inheritance of Jung's literary rights brought an obligation and challenge to his heirs to see through the publication of the German edition of the collected works. In his will, Jung had expressed the wish that the Red Book and the Black Books should remain with his family, without, however, giving more detailed instructions. Since the Red Book was not meant to be published in the collected works, the Society of Heirs concluded that this was Jung's final wish concerning the work, and that it was an entirely private matter. The Society of Heirs guarded Jung's unpublished writings like a treasure. No further publications were considered. The Red Book remained in Jung's study for more than 20 years, entrusted to the care of Franz Jung, who had taken over his father's house. In 1983, the Society of Heirs placed the Red Book in a safe deposit box, knowing that it was an irreplaceable document. In 1984, the newly appointed executive committee had 5 photographic duplicates made for family use. For the first time, Jung's descendants now had the opportunity to take a close look at it. This careful handling had its benefits. The Red Book's well-preserved state is due, among other things, to the fact that it has only rarely been opened in decades. When, after 1990, the editing of the German collected works, a selection of works, was drawing to a conclusion, the executive committee decided to start looking through all the accessible unpublished material with an eye to further publications. I took up this task because in 1994, the Society of Heirs had placed the responsibility for archival and editorial questions on me. It turned out that there was an entire corpus of drafts and variants pertaining to the Red Book. From this, it emerged that the missing part of the calligraphic text existed as a draft, and that there was a manuscript entitled Scrutinies, which continued where the draft ended, containing the 7 sermons. Yet whether and how this substantial material could be published remained an open question. At first glance, the style and content appeared to have little in common with Jung's other works. Much was unclear, and by the mid-1990s, there was no one left who could have provided first-hand information on these points. However, since Jung's time, the history of psychology had been gaining in importance and could now offer a new approach. While working on other projects, I had come in contact with Sonu Shamdasani. In extensive talks, we discussed the possibility of further Jung publications, both in general terms as well as with regard to the Red Book. The book had emerged within a specific context with which a reader at the turn of the 21st century is no longer familiar. But a historian of psychology would be able to present it to the modern reader as a historical document. With the help of primary sources, he could embed it in the cultural context of its genesis, situate it within the history of science, and relate it to Jung's life and works. In 1999, Sonu Shamdasani developed a publication proposal following these guiding principles. On the basis of this proposal, the Society of Heirs decided in spring 2000, not without discussion, to release the Red Book for publication and to hand over the task of editing it to Sonu Shamdasani. I have been asked repeatedly why, after so many years, the Red Book is now being published. Some new understandings on our part played a major role. Jung himself did not, as it had seemed, consider the Red Book a secret. On several occasions, the text contains the address, "Dear Friends." It is, in other words, directed at an audience. Indeed, Jung let close friends have copies of transcriptions and discuss these with them. He did not categorically rule out publication. He simply left the issue unresolved. Moreover, Jung himself stated that he had gained the material for all his later works from his confrontation with the unconscious. As a record of this confrontation, the Red Book is thus, beyond the private sphere, central to Jung's work. This understanding allowed the generation of Jung's grandchildren to look at the situation in a new light. The decision-making process took time. Exemplary excerpts, concepts, and information helped them to deal more rationally with an emotionally charged matter. Finally, the Society of Heirs decided democratically that the Red Book could be published. It was a long journey from that decision to the present publication. The result is impressive. This edition would not have been possible without the cooperation of many people who devoted their skill and energy to a common goal. On behalf of the descendants of C.G. Jung, I would like to express my sincere thanks to all the contributors. April 2009. Signed by Ulrich Hörny, Foundation of the Works of C.G. Jung. Okay, so that's the other preface. And now I'll look back. I should mention that there is rumor that there will be sort of a second volume. Some people say it's a volume with the black books in it. Others have suggested that it may be a second volume of the Red Book. I have heard a rumor that the Red Book, as published in 2009, only includes about 55% of the material that Sonu Shamdasani had available to him at the time. And I read something else recently which said that there are about 100,000 pages of typescript of Dr. Jung's work that has not yet been published, and about 35,000 letters. Now, that may seem like a lot, but think of how many times you write an email in a day, and multiply that by 60-some years of active professional life of Dr. Jung, who didn't have email available to him, and then you can understand how it is possible that he would have so many letters in his oeuvre. Okay, let me go back and see what I've missed here. Okay, so Mr. Krishnamurti, after talking about the guru and arise and walk, said, you think when you don't do anything, or you don't want to do anything. Thinking is a poor alternative to acting. Your thinking is consuming all your energy. Act, don't think. And that reminds me of a favorite quote from John le Carré's novel, The Honorable Schoolboy, in which the hero is a spy for MI6. He's operating in Southeast Asia, and he's gives the advice, act first, apologize later, because if you don't, pretty soon you'll have to get London's permission to change your nappies. And I read that right before I went to spend 5 years in Japan, running the subsidiary of a company, and I took that advice very seriously, and it also reminds me that I used to go to cocktail parties and in Tokyo, and the main people that were in my social group of foreigners were either bankers or oil company executives, and they would say something to the effect like this to me: Skip, don't you get tired of headquarters telling you what to do? Because obviously that was their complaint. And I said, no, I don't get tired of having them tell me what to do, because they don't tell me what to do. I tell them what to do. And so anyway, that's for what it's worth. So anyway, Mr. Krishnamurti goes on, and please read between the lines. I'm not saying this for every situation of life, and nor am I. And then Mr. Rajura asks Mr. Krishnamurti for his profession, and Krishnamurti says, none whatsoever, college degree, and currently a businessman. Okay, well, I count businessman as being a profession, but such as it is. So Nikolai Begaskov Jensen says, from a biological standpoint, I just can't make out how Jung should be able to get such a waste understand. I think he must mean wide, maybe, understanding of the collective unconscious through. How does such skill correlate with survival instincts? And Krishnamurti says, Nikolai, humans only require food, shelter, and clothing in order to survive from a purely biological standpoint. However, humans have a very complex and developed brain in which psychology comes into existence. This is where C.G. Jung can help those suffering from mental issues, because humans are highly intellectual and emotional, so much so that sanity in this world is a requirement for survival. I would just add to that intuition is an instinct, and it comes under the category of personality types, or the Myers-Briggs types. You can find quite a bit more on this YouTube channel about the personality types. I gave a lecture on it, which I believe is it's either lecture number 2 or number 4 back in playlist JRG 1. That's Jung Reading Group Year 1. We're now in Year 3. But if you go back into that playlist, you can find my specific video in which I discuss personality types. And so these are functions which have come even from the primitives. I mean, primitives are very aware, and people that are used to working in the bush, or even U.S. Marines, for example, or the first time I experienced it really was from Korean Marines who were training with me at the basic school, and they had already been to Vietnam. But those 10 Korean Marines in my class had a real instinct for being in the field, and they just knew, they always knew before the American Marines when there was an enemy in our war games that we were playing down at Quantico. And so I think that intuition is definitely an instinct, and it's definitely a survival skill, and it's a survival skill that we still use. So let's see. And so then going to applying that to the collective unconscious, I think that Dr. Jung experienced this directly in 1913 when he started to have his visions of the oncoming onset of World War I. And those visions are described in the Red Book. And when he thought that he was having a psychosis, it was because of those visions, because he didn't understand what they were. But when World War I broke out, he said he was the happiest man in Europe, because he then knew that he was plugging in to the unconscious of Western Europeans. And so then he was able to start to develop that instinct from that ability, that intuitive ability. And I've discussed on many occasions how my intuition works, where I, for example, I never have needed a radar detector for my car, because I always know when the police are nearby or when they're running a speed trap. And it has nothing to do with my conscious ability. It has to do with my unconscious ability. And I'm not going to go into it in great detail now, but that does connect into the collective unconscious. And so all that insight that Dr. Jung was having at the time of the Red Book, and amplified throughout World War I, does show that these things are survival instincts. Now, they're not for everyone, unfortunately, because if you take the Myers-Briggs type indicator, you will find that you are graded on a percentile of how far out on the intuitive scale or the sensing scale, which is the opposite end of the scale. You will find where you fall on that. And just to sum it up very briefly, a sensing person, you can show 1,000 trees and they won't believe there's a forest. An intuitive person, you can show 3 trees and they will believe there's a forest. And so it so happens that for better or for worse, I ended up at the 99th percentile on the intuitive end of the scale. I don't know why, but unfortunately, that means that I don't know what you know or don't know, because I'm so far out that I can't know what it's like to be like you unless you're also out on the 99th percentile also. And so I can only describe it in general terms, and then you need to go study. And if you want to learn a lot about the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is called the MBTI for short, you can find many books. Let's see, did that go across it? Oh, it might have gone across, but I'm higher up on this thing. Anyway, MBTI, Myers-Briggs type indicator, and there are many books on it. You can find them in any local bookstore or on Amazon. Now let's see. So Grenade said it goes with having an abnormally high level of introverted intuition, and certainly I'm introverted. I really like talking to a camera, but if all of you were in the room with me, it might be intimidating to me. No, that's not true, because I went to a college that required us to take public speaking every year, so I learned how to speak publicly, but others who are introverted might have a hard time. Understanding the collective unconscious is a sort of mental masturbation. We want to know more and more and more about ourselves, which interferes with our natural biological state. We have to come to terms with this fallible aspect of humanity. We cause a lot of our suffering, but it is not our fault. We are built like so. Well, Mr. Krishnamurti, I think I will take exception with that, because I think it is a part of our natural biological state. And I think that I went to a college who had as its motto in Greek, which is on the college seal, know yourself, which obviously was also on the door of Delphi, of the Temple of Delphi, the Oracle of Delphi, 3,000 years ago. But I don't consider the collective unconscious or understanding it a sort of mental masturbation. I think more of it as a gift. And so what it means is that I often can predict the future with fairly clear understanding of what will happen, and many other people can't. And so it certainly fits within my personality type and is not autoeroticism for me, but it may be autoeroticism for someone else with a different personality type, and I don't presume to comment on other people in that way. And I don't agree that it is a fallible aspect of humanity. I think it's a routine and common aspect of humanity. And if you are gifted to be able to plug into the collective unconscious, you will see many benefits. And Grenade says also Jung, Also Jung was very well read and could speak dead languages. I don't know if he could speak them, but he certainly could read and write them. He had a knack for drawing parallels between the stories of different cultures to uncover something deeper biologically or otherwise. Yes, definitely. He could read dead languages, and it's what the ancients would have called a prophet or mystic, very good at instinctively predicting future events on a subconscious level to the point where they aren't even sure how they were right. And Grenade goes on, so biologically, a useful personality type for a group to have, shamans or mystics, were regarded highly in society by ancients. Sorry, Skip, you don't have to read all this. It was for the above commentator. Too many words. Miles says, act, don't think. My wife would say I need to hear that. Mr. Krishnamurti goes on, whether you are interested in moksha, liberation, freedom, transformation, you name it, you are interested in happiness without one moment of unhappiness, pleasure without pain, it is the same thing. But there is no way you can have one without the other. This demand is not in the interest of the survival of this living organism. Well, I do agree that it is the opposite side of pain. I don't agree that it's a detriment to have it. I don't agree that it guarantees happiness, but I think we need to know ourselves and know what makes us happy. I'll just give an example of that just a moment. Hopefully, okay, here's an example. Here's a man who thought that a 63-foot-long power boat would make him happy. But as you see, he's not on it, and the boat is docked in the marina in my community. And so I don't think that he had a very good clue about his personal happiness. That's my view. And, this is, that's a sort of a side effect of the materialism that the West has largely adopted over the 20th century. And so you think that, boy, if only I had a 63-foot powerboat, I would be happy. But what you learn pretty much and pretty quickly, if you're a boat owner, if you haven't heard the old saw, it is the happiest days of your life are the day you get your boat and the day you get rid of it. And between those 2 days, it's a hole in the water in which you pour money. So anyway, and so you do have to have pain. I agree with that, and it would be painful to own such a boat and not be able to use it. That's clear. My friend from Norway, whose name I can't pronounce, says, does intuition work opposite to different genders? As far as I know, no. In other words, I think stereotypically women have more intuition than men do. But a man or a woman can be intuitive, and a man or a woman can be sensing. And it just depends on who you are and where you are. Now, in Women Who Run with the Wolves, which is Clarissa Pinkola Estes's best-selling book from the 1990s, you can find the story of Vasilisa the Wise, which is, I can never remember whether it starts on page 74 or page 94. It's one of the two. But in any case, after that story, Dr. Estes puts the 9 steps of women's individuation as it relates to intuition. And so what is implicit there is that among women, there are methodologies, processes by which women are taught to be more intuitive. But it doesn't mean that you're innately intuitive, and you need to go through these stepwise processes if you're a woman to become intuitive. Now, how that applies to a man, I don't really know. I don't know where my intuition came from. I only know that it's there. And Nikolai says, thanks for the answer and comments. I have also experienced such instincts in myself. Yeah, I mean, you can definitely experience them directly. Frank, who has a Scandinavian name, I'm sorry I can't pronounce it, Frank, but which book from Carl Jung for others would you say explains shadow integration the best? I think that Dr. Jung, one of the shortcomings of Dr. Jung's work is that he didn't really say it in one place very clearly. But there is a chapter on the shadow in Ion. Let's see. Yes, I have it right in front of me. So here's Ion, which researches into the phenomenology of the self. And I just knocked it off the screen, but I can put back on the screen Dr. Edinger's image of where the shadow fits in the structure. Let me see if I can find that conveniently, and I can get that to you on this. Let's see here. I know I have it. And let's see. Okay. I haven't put these all in a very clear place, so sorry, I have to look past my camera for a minute. I have to put these together somewhere where I can find them easily in a hurry. I apologize for the delay here. Well, I don't seem to have it handy. I apologize for that. But you can, let's see, I happen to have the book. So let me show you the book I'm reading. So it's this book, Edward Edinger, The Ion Lectures. And this is Dr. Edinger's lectures about Ion, which is sometimes difficult to understand. And so in this book, he has put these diagrams. I can show it to you, I believe. Book, but I had scanned it at one point. Okay, it's diagram 5. Okay, so here's Dr. Edinger's diagram of the psyche. The self is here. Then there's the syzygy, which is the anima and animus, and these circles represent 3 different egos. One is a man's ego, a woman's ego, and a theoretical neutral-ish ego. And then the shadow is this part here that goes between the ego and the self. And let's see here. So it must be, okay, paragraphs 13 to 42 of Ion. So I have read those paragraphs of Ion 13 to 42 into the YouTube channel. And if you go to the main page of the YouTube channel, you can find a playlist which is right across the screen, maybe the 3rd or 4th row down, and you can find the playlist for Ion, and then find the, you can find both Dr. Jung's book, Ion itself, and Dr. Edinger's commentary on that playlist. So, so I'm currently reading a book. Where is it? Okay, I'm currently reading a book by Dr. Ulanoff called The Wisdom of the Psyche. And in it, she's got a very good discussion of the shadow. And there's also a very good discussion of evil and the shadow in her other book, The Unshuttered Heart. So I'll put those 2 names up here. These are excellent books which I'm currently reading, and parts of them have been read into the YouTube channel, so you can get a taste anyway. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So Sean says, if a man speaks in the desert and no woman hears him, is he still wrong? Where is this from? That's from a coffee cup which I bought in Arizona. However, it definitely applies, and the answer to the question is yes, he is. And the reason for that is that we're not whole in ourselves. That's why marriage has to work, because it helps to bring the other side in. And so in marriage counseling, the Myers-Briggs is often used because if you have, there's 4 scales of personality type in the Myers-Briggs. And if you have all 4 scales, if you're all the same, for example, extroverted and introverted, so it so happens that my wife and I are both introverted, and the next scale is sensing or intuitive. It happens that my wife and I are both intuitive, Then thinking and feeling, that's the classic dichotomy between men and women, although testing in the late 20th century suggested that that's pretty much evened out, but it's the head versus the heart. And the final scale is judging and perceiving, and that's the only one on which my wife and I differ. And so in marriage counseling, it's always best if you have 2 or 3 personality scales the same. If you are all different, in other words, if your wife always represents your inferior side and you always represent her inferior side, you'll have too much conflict. And if you are all the same, you're going to have a boring life. And if you're all different, you're going to have too much conflict. So it's best that you have at least 2 or 3 the same. As my wife and I have 3 the same, that works out pretty well. And in the judging and perceiving scale, the way I humorously refer to that is a judging person goes to the grocery store with a shopping list and picks everything off the shopping list off the shelves. A perceiving person goes to the grocery store and just walks up and down the aisles and takes stuff off the shelves. Both personality types eat, and so it's just a different way of attacking the world. And it's not set in stone. In other words, it's very common for military personnel to be STJ, that's sensing, thinking, and judging. And I'm only one of those. I'm thinking. But what I found was that when I put on my persona as a Marine Corps officer, then I could put on the persona of STJ without any problem. And as it happens, the statistics are that 95% of all generals and admirals in the U.S. military are STJ. However, in my experience, those are not the guys that get to the top. Those are the guys that get to 2 stars. They get to be a division commander or something like that. But it's the intuitive types, especially the intuitive thinking types that become 4 stars. And so examples of that would be Colin Powell. He's an excellent example of it. He's non-controversial anymore. And you could also see that in Secretary Mattis and John Kelly, who we see very commonly in our news feed these days. Both of them are obviously intuitive thinking men, and very likely they're both also introverted. And so they would be atypical for Marine Corps officers, but they are very typical for 4-star generals. And so both of them served as 4-star generals, and the significance of that, I think, is that they understand politics and can succeed. The guys that stop at 2 stars, or in most cases they stop at lieutenant colonel, those guys aren't intuitive enough, and they say, oh, just give me a job and I'll go do it. Well, they do it very well, but that doesn't serve them well when they get up to the higher levels and need to be political. At least not in my experience. But if you know that, and if you know about yourself, then, as I say, when I put my uniform on, I can be an STJ too. And so that's only a persona that you put on. let's see. Let's see. So Granat says, women freak me out because they make even less sense than men. Well, and Sean, I'm stealing that quote. And Mr. Krishnamurti says, women, you can't live with them, you can't live without them. And obviously they feel the same way about us. And so the best thing to do is to remember that you are part of a yin-yang dichotomy, and she brings things to the party that you don't bring, and vice versa. And so if you want to have happiness with your grandchildren around you when you're 70 like me, then you better get to know a woman and how to keep her happy. Let's see. Sean Steele says Mattis. Yeah, Mattis. And okay, I don't know, Sean, I don't know Mukayam. I don't know who that is. Yes, but Mr. Krishnamurti says General Mad Dog Mattis. Yes, General Mad Dog Mattis, no doubt, can put the STJ on at his leisure, but he is very obviously an introverted intuitive, and so he was described early on in his being appointed to be Secretary of Defense as being like a monk, and that probably would be an accurate description. I mean, I don't know anything about General Mattis. He actually, very probably in the Marine Corps, he was junior to me for the entire time I was in, because I've met 4-star generals and they're 6 or 8 years younger than me typically these days. And so I don't know how old of a man he is, but very typically they are now guys that I would have been training in the Marine Corps. So I have a held message from Mr. Krishnamurti. Let me just look at it. Mattis says, I come in peace. I didn't bring artillery, but I'm pleading with you with tears in my eyes. If you F with me, I'll kill you all. Okay, I'll put that in. This is an adult group, that's what Marines are. I mean, oversexed, underpaid killers, and so the Marine Corps is an instrument. It's an instrument of war, and if you call upon that instrument, then it will do what you tell it to do. So that does sound like a Marine general to me. Also, while he may have said that, very likely if the Marines show up, they do have artillery, they have air, and they have their own boats, and they have everything you need. And when I was at the National War College, I was in a class with a major general from the Army, and he was talking about the Marine Corps almost enviously, because he said that the Marines bring you a very nice package, because we bring everything we need. We bring our own artillery, we bring our own tanks, we bring our own jet fighters, both land-based and sea-based, and we bring our own helicopters. Well, we bring our own logistics and all that as well. And so obviously you can see that I'm quite proud of my service in the Marine Corps. And I've been affiliated with the Naval Services for my whole life. So, and I've carried an ID card for 62 years, if you can believe that, since I was 10 years old. When I was 10 years old, I was dependent on my father. But since 1967, I've carried my own ID card. Let's see. Sean says, I watched a video about him going to the front lines to see how the men felt. He recommends reading Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield. Okay, I'm not familiar with that one. But obviously all generals probably go to the front lines. There's a psychological phenomenon that took me a long time to figure out. I used to call it the combat officer's phenomenon, and that was a phenomenon where you lost fear. You didn't fear anymore, and so of course General MacArthur and General Patton were very famous for walking out in front of the front lines. In fact, during World War II, among other times, and they did it entirely fearlessly. And actually, there's a very nice scene about it in the movie Patton, where General Patton is describing to Carl Malden how he had dreamed about a bullet coming straight between his eyes, type thing. And so the phenomenon, the psychological phenomenon, which I observed, is that, when I was in Vietnam, I was fearful all the time. And, I was aware 7x24 that a rocket could land on my head all the time. And it did worry me. I was fearful of that. And, but that doesn't stop you from being a Marine. It only gathers your attention, let's say. But generals like that are not fearful because they pass a certain psychological point. And later on, when I was in Japan as a businessman, I went to a seminar on Zen, believe it or not, on Zen Buddhism. And I learned what it is, and it is passing a point of total competence. And so all of us know examples of this. When you're learning to ride a bicycle, as long as you have to think about steering and pedaling and balancing, you can't ride a bicycle. It's only when you can stop thinking about those things that you can ride a bicycle. And since all of us are obviously capable on the keyboard, because we're here on a computer system, when you're learning to type, as long as you have to think about where the letters are on your keyboard, you can't type. But once you can forget where the letters are and just type, then you can type. And so it's like that. If you're in the military, if you do it enough, it becomes second nature, and you don't even think about what the risks are. And I'm convinced that I have that right now, because I thought about that issue for many years, and what was the difference between me as someone who was fearful during my entire deployment. It didn't mean I didn't do my job. I did do my job, but it meant that I was always anxious about the situation. And the difference between me like that and the officer who can go out and not even think about the danger, there's a difference. It's a qualitative difference. So anyway, and Sean says, have I ever experienced Japanese people having racism toward the Chinese? Yes, of course I have. And I'll answer further questions, but I'm not going to expound on that. I will say that Japanese are very homogeneous as a nationality, and I'm not sure I would call it racism per se, because they're both obviously Asiatic, but there certainly is a prejudice between Chinese and Japanese, and in the case of Chinese, it's well earned, because obviously the Japanese came during World War II and killed tens of millions of Chinese, and going back to the rape of Nanking and so on. So there's a long, long history there. The same applies with the Koreans. Sean says, I know I used to be like that. I just wonder if things have changed. Okay, I don't know what that is in that sentence. I don't understand that point. But anyway, I have to run along, gents. If there are other questions, I will quickly answer them. But I have a date with my girlfriend to pick her up at her work. And so, and by girlfriend, I mean my wife. So, anyway, it's pretty handy to have a perspective that doesn't allow you to feel guilty anymore about things. And so I'll leave it at that. I'm not going to go into detail on a video that can be passed around the world, but anyway. Okay, so thanks. I'm going to shove off. I hope this has been useful to you. I'm pleased that we've had so many people participating in this particular session. And so Nikolai says, what can I gain from reading and studying Carl Jung? Gain, yes. Okay, here's the thing. Apparently, according to Dr. Ulanoff, one of the objectives of psychotherapy is to broaden your psyche, to make more room and more openness so that other things can grow in your psyche. And that's what Carl Jung will do for you. Okay, he will definitely broaden your perspective about the world in unimaginable ways. For example, Ion, which researches into the phenomenology of the self, is a tour de force in talking about how various societies talk about the concept of self, and have done for the last 3,500 years. And so it's basically a history book in addition to being a psychology book and a theology book. And so it gives you a very much broader perspective on the world and how to think about the world. you may find it exasperating. I don't know, but it can, and so you can get a sense of it though by just listening to some of my readings about ion, and I would urge you to read or to listen to on this YouTube channel the very first videos in the playlist where I'm reading both Dr. Edinger's introduction and Dr. Jung's introduction, so you get a sense of it. And Mr. Krishnamurti says, you resemble Steve Martin to me, Skip. Well, I've never been mistaken for a comedian, I don't think, but I'm not offended by that. Let's see. Carl Jung got me into pipe smoking. I'd like to thank him, says Krishnamurti. Well, I had a bout of pipe smoking, and as an artillery officer, I had a bout of cigar smoking, because by tradition, artillery officers smoked cigars so that they could light their cannons off. Not in my day, because by the time I got to Fort Sill, we weren't lighting off cannons with cigars, but somehow I got past all that. And but the gravelly nature of my voice comes thanks to my father smoking 2 cigarettes a day, or 2 packs of cigarettes a day for about 30 years, and 1 pack for another 30 years. So he smoked for 60 years. He lived to be 83. The bad news is that he never could give up smoking by Chantix or all those other gimmicks that people use to give up smoking. But when he was 68, he got put on oxygen, and that stopped him from smoking, because you don't want to be smoking around an oxygen tank. Frank says, Krishnamurti taught me to do self-inquiry in a new way, thanks to him. Okay, and you're talking about Jiddu Krishnamurti, I presume, and although maybe it was Upaluri who did it, who knows? In many ways, you're a very wise man, Mr. Krishnamurti, but and so I wouldn't want to suggest otherwise. But I will say that Krishnamurti did expand my thinking as well. His centennial came along about, I would say 15 years ago now, maybe. And there was a book that was published at that time called 100 Years of Krishnamurti or something like that. And it's a terrific book. I got it, and I had it on my shelf for many years. I think I finally passed it along to others in the hopes that it would help them. But I love that book, and I can highly recommend it. So it's called, it's either the Centennial of Krishnamurti or 100 Years of Krishnamurti. And now I'm talking about Jiddu Krishnamurti. And Sean says, have I heard of Carlos Castaneda? Of course I have heard, but I don't know enough about Carlos Castaneda to stick in your eye, so I'm not going to say anything about him. Anyway, okay, I'm going to go pick up my girlfriend from her job. And thank you for being here all. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.